The old mansion stood in the dark, its weathered facade looming over the barren landscape. Emma had come seeking a story, a glimpse into its forgotten past, but as soon as she stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with silence, and the shadows seemed to shift with every step she took. Each creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty halls, but it wasn't just the house settling, something else was awake here. The deeper she ventured, the stronger the feeling grew, until she realized she wasn't alone. And whatever was here, it wasn't interested in her leaving. The sound of a distant crow echoed across the desolate cityscape as the last rays of sunlight flickered, fading slowly beneath the horizon. The abandoned hospital, once a bustling refuge for the sick and dying, stood in eerie silence. Alex felt his heartbeat quicken as he gazed up at the crumbling structure, a sense of anticipation mixed with dread pulling at him. His fingers tightened around the flashlight in his grip, the only source of light in the growing darkness. Despite the fear tugging at him, Alex couldn't help but feel exhilarated. He had spent months preparing for this moment, researching the history of this place, reading every account of the supernatural encounters that had been linked to it. Stories of shadowy figures in the windows, voices carried by the wind, and strange apparitions had filled his mind. But Alex wasn't one to be easily swayed by rumors and ghost stories. No, he was here for the thrill, for the stories he would later tell his friends. He wasn't afraid of ghosts or spirits, he was afraid of missing out on an adventure. As the last remnants of sunlight slipped away, the cold set in. Alex pulled his jacket tighter around himself and stepped forward, his shoes crunching over the gravel. The air smelled stale, heavy with dust and decay. The hospital loomed above him, casting long shadows across the entrance. Every window was boarded up, and the heavy wooden door looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. Yet, there was an undeniable pull, a beckoning energy that Alex couldn't resist. He pushed the door open. The creaking of the hinges sent a shiver down his spine. The darkness inside was thick, like the very air had been trapped within for years. He switched on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness, revealing broken furniture, rusted equipment, and walls stained with time. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, someone, to disturb its solitude. With every step, the silence grew louder, more oppressive. The sound of Alex's breathing was the only thing breaking the stillness, yet it felt as though the air itself was holding something, something unseen, something that had been waiting for him. His mind raced with thoughts. It's just an old building. Just a building. He repeated the mantra, but his heart wasn't convinced. The walls seemed to close in on him, each shadow stretching longer than the last. He ventured deeper into the hospital, drawn to a long, dark hallway that appeared to stretch infinitely. The beam of his flashlight trembled as it illuminated the once vibrant murals on the walls, faded depictions of healing and hope, now covered in grime and decay. As he moved closer to the main ward, a faint sound echoed through the corridor. Alex froze. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the air was too still. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, almost like the tapping of footsteps, but they were too soft, too measured. They weren't human. The hairs on the back of Alex's neck stood up. Get a grip, he told himself. But the voice of reason was drowned out by the rising tension in his chest. His pulse quickened. He had to know what it was. He had to see. He took a deep breath and pushed forward, the beam of his flashlight dancing erratically on the walls as he moved. The air grew colder, and the smell of mildew filled his nostrils. A shiver ran down his spine, but he refused to stop. There was something waiting for him in the shadows, and he would find it. The footsteps continued, now closer, but still indistinct, as if something was following him but staying just out of view. He reached the main ward. The door creaked open under his hand, and a gust of cold air rushed out. Alex's breath caught in his throat. The room was massive, its ceiling soaring high above, lined with peeling paint and broken tiles. The floor was covered in debris, and the remnants of old medical equipment were scattered across the room. But what caught Alex's attention most were the windows. Cracked and boarded up, they seemed to hold something within them, something hidden in the darkness that even the dim light of his flashlight could not penetrate. The footsteps were louder now, closer still. The temperature in the room dropped. Alex's fingers tightened around the flashlight, but his hand trembled. He turned slowly, expecting to see nothing. But when he looked over his shoulder, he saw it. A shadow? No, not a shadow. It was too dark, too solid, to be a shadow. It moved swiftly across the far wall, just beyond the reach of the light, vanishing into the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't his imagination. Something was in here with him. The chill in the room deepened. The air felt like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Alex couldn't move. His feet felt frozen to the floor, his body stiff with fear. The shadow shifted again, this time closer. He heard the faintest sound, something like a whisper, too quiet to decipher, but filled with a quiet urgency. He wasn't alone. Something was here, something that had been waiting for him to cross into its domain. His flashlight flickered and dimmed. He cursed under his breath and shook it, but the light barely held. The whispers grew louder. They were coming from the far corner of the room, from the darkness just out of reach. A sudden, cold gust of wind blew through the room, rattling the windows, and for a brief moment, Alex felt a presence behind him. He whipped around, but the room was empty. The darkness swallowed the light, and for a split second, Alex thought he saw something move. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the farthest corner, its face obscured in shadow. Panic surged in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run. But his legs refused to cooperate. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the unknown. The temperature plummeted further. A freezing gust of wind brushed past him, making his skin prickle with cold. The whispers turned into words, soft, slithering whispers that curled into his ears, filling his mind with dread. Before it's too late, he spun around again, searching the room. There was nothing. No figure. No shadow. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own ragged breath. But then, just as his heart began to calm, he heard it. A loud bang, a sharp, deafening sound that echoed through the room. Alex's heart stopped. The sound had come from behind him, from one of the old, rusted doors leading to another hallway. His body jerked in shock, and his flashlight flickered again, casting a weak beam of light toward the door. It was ajar now. The door that had been solidly closed just moments before. Slowly, Alex took a step back, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What had opened the door? Had he done it in his panic? Was it some kind of trick? Or had something else, something far worse, done it for him? His feet moved of their own accord, creeping toward the door. He couldn't stop himself. The pull was too strong, too undeniable. The shadows seemed to beckon him, and his body followed, one step at a time, toward the darkness that awaited beyond the door. As he reached the threshold, something unseen brushed against his neck, icy fingers that made him freeze in place. He wasn't alone. He would never be alone again. And then, in the blink of an eye, something dark rushed toward him, faster than anything human could move. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room fell into total silence once again. The air in the abandoned asylum was thick with dust and the weight of forgotten memories. The moment James, Sarah, and Michael crossed the threshold, the world outside seemed to vanish. The moonlight barely penetrated the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the cracked tile floor. The silence was overwhelming, but the trio tried to mask their unease with laughter. "All right, guys, who's ready to find some ghosts?" James grinned, his voice slightly too loud, an attempt to fill the empty space. He led the way, flashlight in hand, casting a beam across the grimy hallway that stretched far beyond their vision. The asylum, with its long corridors and decaying walls, seemed endless, as though it was trying to swallow them whole. "Let's just be careful," Sarah's voice broke through the laughter, tinged with a hint of nervousness she couldn't quite hide. She glanced nervously at the walls, each cracked plaster and faded paint adding to the building's sense of decay. There was something inherently unsettling about the place. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt forgotten, like it was waiting for something to return. "Don't tell me you're scared," Michael teased, his voice dripping with mockery as he nudged Sarah. He was the type to mock fear, always confident that nothing could touch him. But even his bravado didn't mask the flicker of unease in his eyes as the temperature seemed to drop with every step they took deeper into the asylum. They walked down the corridor, their footsteps echoing through the hollow, empty halls. The only sound besides their voices was the occasional drip of water leaking through the walls. It felt as though the building itself was slowly disintegrating bit by bit under the weight of time and neglect. "Here's where they kept the patients who went mad," James said as he led them to a large, rusted door. "You know, the ones who thought the world was out to get them." The door creaked ominously as it swung open, revealing what looked like an old ward, broken beds, rusted medical instruments scattered across the floor. A faded chalkboard on the wall still held the remnants of old notes, most of them illegible. James stepped inside, followed by Michael, who was too curious to stay behind. Sarah hesitated at the doorway, her unease growing. She had read about places like this before, abandoned hospitals, asylums, and the rumors that came with them. The stories of tormented souls lingering, unable to escape the tragedies of their past. "Sarah, don't tell me you're scared now," Michael called from inside, his voice mocking but laced with a faint edge of discomfort. "There's nothing here but dust and rust." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The coldness in the air wasn't just from the absence of warmth in the building. It was something deeper, something that seemed to seep into her bones. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, entering the room reluctantly. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further. It was as if the building had been holding its breath, waiting for them to come inside. The air felt thick and stagnant, pressing against her lungs, making it harder to breathe. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, moving in ways that didn't make sense. "I'll go check the basement," James said suddenly, turning toward a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "You guys stay here if you're too scared." "You're an idiot," Sarah muttered under her breath. But before she could protest further, he had already disappeared into the shadows, his flashlight beam flickering as he descended. "Should we go after him?" Michael asked, looking toward Sarah, his playful demeanor shifting slightly. He, too, felt the tension in the air, though he wasn't ready to admit it. "We'll give him 5 minutes," Sarah said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Then we go after him. It's not safe to split up." As they waited in silence, the sound of dripping water grew louder. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper within the building, echoing through the halls like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. Sarah felt her chest tighten, the oppressive atmosphere pressing in on her. Something about the place felt alive, as though the walls were watching them, listening to their every movement. The feeling of being observed was suffocating. "Okay, 5 minutes are up," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper now. "Let's go find him." The two of them made their way toward the staircase, the air growing colder with each step they took. As they descended, the light from their flashlights barely cut through the thick darkness. Each step echoed like a drumbeat in the silence, and the heavy weight of the unknown hung over them. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight beam landed on the concrete floor, revealing a hallway that stretched into nothingness. There were no doors, only bare walls, the peeling paint flaking off in places, revealing the concrete beneath. The hallway seemed endless, stretching farther than they could see. But there, at the far end of the corridor, James's flashlight flickered. "James?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer. Without thinking, they both moved toward the flickering light, the silence around them thickening with each step. The air was so cold now that Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, her teeth chattering despite the warmth of her jacket. The shadows seemed to close in around them, their flashlight beams doing little to push back the darkness. When they finally reached James, they found him standing at the end of the hall, staring at something on the floor. He didn't move when they called his name, didn't even flinch when Sarah grabbed his arm. "James?" she repeated, her voice breaking. But he didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something beyond her, something in the darkness that neither she nor Michael could see. "James!" Michael shouted, shaking him. Finally, James blinked, his eyes clearing, but his expression was distant, like he had been in a trance. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Michael asked, his voice full of frustration and concern. "I saw something," James said, his voice trembling, though he tried to sound convincing. There was something in the corner. I could feel it. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, something? There's nothing here, James. But James's face was pale now, his usual bravado gone. I saw it, he repeated. It was watching me. The silence between them deepened, the shadows seeming to shift again. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something wasn't right. She turned to Michael, but he was already looking at her with wide eyes, a mixture of fear and confusion on his face. Before she could ask him what was wrong, a low, guttural growl echoed through the hallway, so deep and primal that it vibrated through her bones. It wasn't a sound made by anything human. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very depths of the building. It felt like the asylum had woken up, like it had finally noticed their presence. The temperature plummeted even further. Sarah's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the growling grew louder, closer. Something was coming for them. We need to get out of here, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, though she knew they all heard it. She took a step back, but before they could move, the hallway seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, warping the space around them. The growl was now replaced by whispers, soft and insistent, like hundreds of voices speaking at once. They couldn't make out the words, but they could feel the malice behind them. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered out. The darkness engulfed them completely. In the pitch black, Sarah heard a sound, a soft, slithering noise, like something dragging itself across the floor. Her heart raced, and she instinctively reached out for Michael, but her hand brushed against empty air. Panic surged as the whispers grew louder, overwhelming them. Then, a sharp, high-pitched scream pierced the air, a scream that sounded like it was coming from all directions at once. It was a sound unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, full of pain and terror. Something was in the dark with them. Something that wanted them to stay. Emma had always been fascinated by old, forgotten places, but this was different. The mansion stood before her like a dark, looming giant, its broken windows like eyes watching her approach. The air around it felt heavy, weighed down with a history that seemed unwilling to let go. She had heard the rumors, of course, the tales of the mansion's tragic past, of a family that had vanished mysteriously, leaving only whispers behind. But Emma wasn't one to buy into local superstition. She was a photographer, not some thrill-seeker chasing ghost stories. Still, even as she walked through the rusted gates and toward the crumbling entrance, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease crawl under her skin. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and grandeur, now stood in ruins. The walls, once vibrant with rich tapestries and paintings, were faded and chipped, bearing the marks of time and neglect. The garden, which must have once been a marvel, was now overgrown with weeds and wild vines. Yet, despite its decay, there was something undeniably captivating about it, something that made Emma feel like she was on the cusp of discovering a hidden story, a truth buried deep within its walls. She stepped inside, her boots crunching on the debris that covered the floor. The smell of mold and dust filled her nose as she switched on her flashlight, the beam of light slicing through the darkness. The foyer stretched out before her, grand but desolate. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister twisted and broken in places. The grand chandelier overhead was still intact, though coated in layers of dust and cobwebs, and its crystals glimmered faintly in the dim light. There was a stillness in the air, a silence that felt unnatural. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of life, of warmth, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting. Emma took another step forward, her footsteps echoing against the empty walls. She paused, sensing something just beyond her perception, a strange pressure in the air that she couldn't explain. The house seemed to be alive in some way, its silence heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. She could almost hear the whispers of those who had once lived here, voices lost to time but still lingering in the shadows. The flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, and Emma's pulse quickened. She shook the flashlight, hoping it wasn't the batteries. But when the light steadied again, her heart skipped a beat. On the wall in front of her was a portrait, an old, faded painting of a family, their faces frozen in time. The frame was tarnished, and the colors of the painting had long since bled together, but the expressions of the people in the painting were clear enough. There was a man, tall and imposing, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Beside him stood a woman, delicate and beautiful, her expression serene but distant. And between them was a child, no older than 7 or 8, with wide, innocent eyes that seemed to gaze directly into Emma's soul. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as her flashlight fell upon the family's faces. There was something unsettling about them, something that felt wrong. The eyes of the man seemed too dark, too knowing, while the woman's face seemed frozen in a forced smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. The child's gaze was the most haunting. It was as though the child knew something terrible, and wanted to warn her. But there was no time to dwell on it. Emma turned away from the portrait, trying to shake off the strange feeling it gave her. She had come here for a purpose, to document the decay of the mansion, not to get lost in the stories it told. She made her way deeper into the house, exploring room after room, each more decayed than the last. The furniture was covered in white sheets, their once luxurious fabric now yellowed with age. The wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing bare plaster beneath. But as she ventured further into the mansion, the atmosphere grew heavier. The silence was oppressive, like a thick fog that pressed in on her from all sides. The house was cold, far colder than the outside air, and Emma couldn't help but notice that the temperatures seemed to drop the farther she went. It was in the study that she first felt it. The air in the room was so thick, so still, that it felt like something was watching her from the corners of the room. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. A sense of dread washed over her, but her curiosity won out. She stepped inside. The study was much larger than she had expected, its high ceiling looming overhead. A large desk stood in the center of the room, cluttered with old papers and forgotten books. The shelves were lined with dusty tomes, their spines cracked and faded. But it wasn't the books or the furniture that caught her attention. It was the strange symbols etched into the floor, scattered across the rug in a pattern she couldn't understand. The symbols seemed to pulse with an energy, a force that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Emma crouched down, her flashlight casting a faint glow over the symbols. Her fingers hovered over the rug, just an inch away from the strange carvings, when the air around her suddenly seemed to shift. The temperature dropped again, and Emma's breath became visible in front of her. She stood quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. Something was wrong. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally toward her. She turned to leave, but as she did, a sudden noise, a soft creaking sound, came from behind her. She froze. Her eyes darted toward the door, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there, just beyond the threshold, bathed in shadow. It was fleeting, just a flicker in the corner of her vision, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. She turned back to the desk, her pulse racing. The symbols on the rug seemed to glow now, faintly, as if they had come alive. A sudden, deafening bang sounded from somewhere deeper in the mansion. Emma jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, flashlight shaking in her hand, but there was no one there. The study was empty. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she backed toward the door. Her mind raced, but there was no logical explanation for what was happening. She had to get out. As she hurried through the house, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. It was as though the very walls of the mansion were closing in on her. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards louder than before. She could hear her own footsteps echoing through the empty halls, but there was something else, too. A faint sound, almost like whispering, that seemed to come from just out of reach. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and Emma's skin prickled with a sudden surge of fear. She turned a corner, heading toward the front door, but as she approached the exit, she saw it. The family portrait. The same one she had seen when she first entered. But now, something was different. The eyes of the man were no longer cold and distant. They were wide open, staring directly at her, filled with an intensity that made her stomach drop. The woman's smile had twisted into something grotesque, a grin that stretched too wide for a human face. And the child, Emma's heart stopped as she stared into the child's eyes. The once innocent gaze had transformed into something darker, something malevolent. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable, growing into frantic pleas. "Get up, it's not safe." Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she stumbled backward, but she couldn't move fast enough. The shadows seemed to grow thicker around her, wrapping themselves around her body, constricting her breath. She reached for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was stuck, frozen in place, as if the house itself was keeping her inside. She turned, desperate now, but before she could take another step, a cold hand gripped her wrist. The chill of death radiated from the touch, and Emma's breath hitched in her throat. She spun around, but there was no one there. The hand had vanished, but the feeling remained, like icy fingers still wrapped around her arm. The house was alive. And it was not going to let her leave. The hotel loomed ahead, an imposing structure standing in the middle of nowhere, its once grand facade now covered in layers of grime and neglect. Tim and Rachel had driven for hours to reach this place, their car navigating the winding, deserted roads that led them far from the familiar. The idea had seemed exciting at first, an off-the-beaten-path getaway, a place to escape the noise of the city, to be alone in peace. The hotel, a relic from a time long past, had appeared in the brochure as a charming, vintage retreat. But now, standing in front of it, Rachel felt a growing sense of discomfort. The wind howled through the trees surrounding the building, its whispers unsettling as they pushed open the creaky front door. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with the scent of mildew and something far more unsettling, like stale air that had been trapped in the building for decades. Tim stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the dimness, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The lobby was vast, with towering columns that had once been grand but were now chipped and faded, their once pristine marble tarnished by time. The furniture was a strange mix of antique and decaying, chairs and tables covered in dusty cloths, as though the building had been frozen in time. The grand chandelier overhead hung in near darkness, its crystals dull and yellowed. Rachel shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the cold seep into her bones. "Doesn't look so bad," Tim said, his voice breaking the silence. He was trying to sound reassuring, but there was an edge to his tone that Rachel couldn't ignore. Even he couldn't pretend the place didn't feel wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room, the air feeling colder with each passing minute. Rachel glanced at the walls, where old paintings hung crookedly, their faces obscured by layers of grime and time. One painting caught her eye, a portrait of a woman dressed in a rich, Victorian gown. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow, her expression hauntingly melancholic. Rachel shuddered, looking away quickly, as if the painting itself was watching her. Tim moved toward the reception desk, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. "Hello? Anyone here?" he called, his voice reverberating through the empty space. But there was no answer, only the sound of his voice bouncing back at him. Rachel felt a sudden pang of unease, a sensation that crawled up her spine and settled in the pit of her stomach. She looked around the room again, her eyes lingering on the doorways that led deeper into the hotel. They seemed to beckon, as though the building itself was inviting them in, urging them to explore its decaying depths. "I'll check the rooms," Tim said, turning toward the grand staircase that curved upward into darkness. "Stay here, all right? It'll just be a second." Rachel didn't want to be left alone in this cold, oppressive silence, but she nodded anyway. The uneasy feeling in her chest only grew stronger as Tim's footsteps faded upstairs. The silence of the lobby was suffocating now, pressing down on her, the air thick with the weight of something unseen, something ancient. Her gaze drifted once more to the portrait of the woman on the wall, and this time, it felt like her eyes were following Rachel's every movement. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the strange sound that had begun to echo from somewhere deeper in the hotel. It was faint, but unmistakable, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway just beyond the lobby. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Tim was upstairs. There was no one else here. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. Her pulse quickened as her eyes darted to the hall. The sound wasn't just footsteps now, it was a rhythmic dragging, like something heavy being pulled along the floor. Her heart raced, her chest tightening with a growing sense of dread. No one else is here, she told herself again, but the sound was too real, too close. She backed toward the desk, her eyes fixed on the hallway, waiting for something, anything, to appear. But nothing did. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had begun. "Tim," she called out, her voice trembling. She tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. Her legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move. She glanced nervously at the entrance, but the door was still shut, its darkened threshold offering no escape. She felt trapped. Slowly, she took a step toward the hallway, her flashlight wavering in her hand. The silence had returned, thick and suffocating. Just as she was about to step further into the darkened corridor, the sudden sound of a door creaking open behind her made her freeze. She spun around, her heart in her throat, but there was nothing there. The door to the reception office, which she had been certain was locked moments before, now stood ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Her breath hitched as she glanced toward the staircase. There was no sign of Tim. She was alone. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Rachel took a deep breath and rushed toward the stairs. She wasn't sure what was worse, the overwhelming silence or the feeling that something was lurking just beyond her perception. She had to find Tim. She had to know that he was all right. Her feet moved faster than she meant them to, her pulse thundering in her ears as she ascended the stairs. The higher she climbed, the colder it became, the air thickening with the sense of something wrong, something that had been waiting for them. The shadows pressed in from every corner, wrapping around her like cold hands. At the top of the stairs, the hall stretched out before her, lined with doors to rooms long untouched. There were no lights, only the dim glow of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Tim?" she called again, her voice barely a whisper, but the sound felt too loud in the stillness. There was no response, just the eerie silence of the hotel settling around her. She stepped forward cautiously, the beam of light sweeping across the floor. The walls here were even worse than downstairs, their wallpaper torn and peeling, the edges fraying as if something had been clawing at them. Rachel's heart skipped when she heard a low thud from behind one of the doors. She froze. Her breath caught. She wasn't alone. She knew that now. Slowly, she turned toward the door from which the sound had come. It was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see a sliver of darkness beyond. Another thud. Louder this time. Her pulse quickened as her flashlight flickered, the light wavering in her hand. She approached the door with hesitant steps, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. Before she could touch it, a figure appeared in the doorway, so suddenly that Rachel jumped back with a gasp. Tim stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His clothes were disheveled, and his hair was damp with sweat. His lips parted, but no words came out. He stared at her, his gaze distant, unfocused, as if he were seeing something that wasn't there. "Tim," Rachel said, her voice shaking. She reached out toward him, but before she could touch him, he stepped backward into the room, disappearing into the darkness. A chill ran down her spine, and without thinking, she followed him. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the hotel, the air heavy with a dampness that seeped into her bones. The flashlight beam revealed a room that was sparsely furnished, its furniture covered in white sheets like the rest of the hotel. But it wasn't the furniture that caught Rachel's attention, it was the walls. The room was lined with mirrors, tall, full-length mirrors, their surfaces cracked and covered with dust. The reflections in them were distorted, twisted, like they were trying to show something that wasn't real. "Tim," she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she turned in a slow circle, scanning the room. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far side, his back to her, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His body was rigid, almost lifeless. "Tim, what's going on?" "Talk to me," Rachel said, her voice cracking. But Tim didn't respond. He didn't even move. She took a step closer, but as she did, the mirrors seemed to shift. Her reflection moved independently, twisting into something grotesque. Her heartbeat quickened as she stumbled backward, her eyes widening in horror as the reflections in the mirrors grew distorted, showing faces that weren't hers, twisted, contorted faces that grinned at her from the darkness. Get out of here, Rachel. Tim's voice came, barely a whisper, yet it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. She spun around to face him, but his figure was gone. The room felt suffocating now, the walls closing in, the mirrors stretching toward her. The chill in the air deepened. And then the door slammed shut behind her. The hotel wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it wasn't letting her leave. It was nearly midnight when Mark and Lily finally reached the small, secluded cabin tucked deep in the woods. The night had fallen quickly, and the darkness around them felt like a thick, suffocating blanket. The only sound that filled the air was the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot as they made their way to the front door. The cabin, old and weathered, looked abandoned at first glance. Its wooden walls were warped, and the roof sagged slightly under the weight of years of neglect. Mark was the first to step inside, pushing open the creaky door that seemed to protest the intrusion with an eerie groan. The smell of damp wood and stale air hit them instantly as they entered. Lily hesitated, glancing around at the darkened interior. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. The only furniture was a few worn-out chairs and a faded, threadbare rug in the center of the room. A fireplace sat cold and empty in the corner, its stone mantel covered in dust. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to disturb its long silence. "Seems cozy enough," Mark said, his voice trying to break the stillness, but even his words felt out of place in the eerie quiet. He set down his bag and moved toward the small kitchen area, looking for matches or a lighter. "We can make a fire, get some warmth going." Lily nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. The cabin was too quiet, too still. It felt as if it had been waiting for them, as if it was expecting them to show up. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Mark paused mid-step, glancing at her with a quizzical look. "Hear what?" Lily's eyes scanned the room, her senses prickling with a deep unease. "There's something strange about this place. It's like we're not alone." Mark laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension in the air. "It's probably just the wind. Old cabins creak and groan. No one's been here in ages. You're just spooked." Lily wasn't so sure. She could feel it, an unsettling energy that seemed to pulse through the walls, an oppressive weight that sat heavily on her chest. But she didn't say anything more. She didn't want to appear paranoid. After all, they had come here to get away from everything, to escape the noise of their hectic lives. A weekend in the woods was supposed to be peaceful, a break from the world. But the more she stood there, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was lurking in the corners of the cabin, just beyond the edge of her vision. As Mark struck a match and lit the fireplace, the flickering flames threw dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel even darker, more claustrophobic. The air seemed to grow colder, and Lily instinctively wrapped her arms around herself. Mark continued to poke at the fire, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Lily couldn't stop herself from glancing toward the far corner, where a dark shape seemed to linger, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't a person, not exactly, but the shape was there, dark, formless, like a shadow that didn't belong. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She was just tired, that was all. They had been driving for hours, and the cabin's eerie atmosphere was probably just getting to her. She needed to relax. She forced herself to look away and focus on the fire, the warmth from the flames slowly seeping into her skin. But then, the sound came again, a soft, distant thud. It echoed through the cabin, so faint that she almost thought she had imagined it. Her heart skipped a beat as her gaze shot toward the door. Another thud, louder this time, and then a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Mark had heard it too. He turned, his expression now tense, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Lily nodded, her stomach twisting into knots. "What is that?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and moved toward the door, his flashlight in hand. "I'll check it out. Probably just an animal or something." Lily didn't want him to go. She didn't want to be left alone in the cabin, not with that feeling pressing in on her from every direction. Mark, wait. Don't go out there. But Mark was already halfway to the door, opening it slowly. The wind howled through the crack, sending a chill into the room. Mark stepped outside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but Lily couldn't see where it went. The night was pitch black beyond the door, the trees outside barely visible in the faint glow of the flashlight. For a moment, everything was quiet again. But then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the woods, something large and heavy. A slow, deliberate pace that seemed to circle the cabin. Lily's pulse quickened as the sound grew closer, then stopped. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie silence that made her blood run cold. "Mark?" she called, her voice trembling. "Mark, come back inside." But there was no answer. Her mind raced, panic rising in her chest as she moved toward the door. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to see whatever was out there, whatever was lurking in the darkness, but she couldn't stand the silence. She couldn't stand the unknown. Slowly, she cracked the door open, peering outside, her heart pounding in her ears. The flashlight was lying in the snow, abandoned. Mark was nowhere to be seen. "Mark?" she whispered again, but this time, there was no mistaking the fear in her voice. She stepped outside, her breath coming in short gasps, the cold biting at her skin. The forest stretched out in front of her, dark and endless. She called his name again, louder this time, but all she heard in return was the wind. It felt like an eternity before she finally spotted him. Mark was standing motionless near the tree line, his body frozen in place. His head was tilted back, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring up at the sky. "Mark!" Lily screamed, rushing toward him, but when she reached him, she stopped dead in her tracks. His body was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold. His skin was pale, and his mouth hung open, his expression locked in a silent scream. But it wasn't just the horror in his face that made Lily's stomach drop. It was the mark on his neck, a deep, black bruise that seemed to stretch around it, like something had gripped him from behind and squeezed until the life had been drained from him. There was no blood, no sign of injury, just that unnatural, eerie stillness. Lily's heart raced as she backed away, but as she did, she felt it, a hand, cold and skeletal, brushing against her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty woods, dark and silent, stretching on in every direction. She wasn't alone. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. The forest, once serene and peaceful, now felt like a labyrinth of nightmares, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead no longer existed. The silence was broken only by her ragged breaths, the sound of her own heart hammering in her chest as she turned back toward the cabin, the lights now flickering in the distance. She ran, stumbling over the snow, not daring to look back. She could feel the weight of something following her, the sensation of being watched, hunted. The cold air was thick with an oppressive presence, and the once welcoming light from the cabin now seemed like a beacon of doom, its warmth unreachable. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she grabbed the handle. The wind slammed against her back, pushing her inside, and she barely had time to shut the door behind her before the noise started. The low, guttural growl, the sound of something coming closer, something unseen, but undeniably there. And it was getting closer. The storm raged outside, howling through the trees with such intensity that the cabin shook with every gust of wind. The windows rattled, the doorframe groaned, and the thick wooden beams of the ceiling seemed to creak under the pressure of the storm. Inside, everything was unnervingly still. Marcus had locked the door after Lily came rushing back in, her face pale and eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She hadn't said much, but her expression told him everything he needed to know. Something had happened out there, something that wasn't right. Lily paced back and forth across the small living room, her steps fast and erratic as she tried to catch her breath. Her eyes darted to the window, where the trees outside twisted and bent in the howling wind. She shivered, though the fire in the hearth was still burning bright, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Her hands trembled as she ran them through her hair, her gaze darting nervously between Marcus and the darkened door behind them. I don't understand. I just don't understand what happened, she muttered, her voice breaking as the words tumbled out. I saw his body out there, but then, something touched me, something cold. Marcus didn't know what to say. He wanted to comfort her, reassure her that it was all just a misunderstanding, but he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest, the deep sense of dread that had been slowly creeping up on him since they arrived. There was something off about this place, about the entire situation. The way Mark had disappeared so suddenly, the unnatural stillness of the forest, and now the sudden touch Lily had felt when she was alone in the woods. It didn't make sense. You're not alone, Marcus finally said, trying to find the right words. Whatever it was, it didn't touch you, Lily. It wasn't real. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. The look in Lily's eyes, the fear that still clung to her every movement, told a different story. Something was wrong with this place. He could feel it in his bones. The wind howled louder, a scream that echoed through the trees, and the lights flickered, casting the cabin into darkness for a split second. When they returned, the fire in the hearth had dimmed, casting long, stretching shadows across the walls. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Marcus saw it too, movement in the far corner of the room. A flicker of something, just at the edge of his vision, moving silently across the shadows. Did you see that? Lily's voice was barely a whisper, but the panic in it was unmistakable. She had seen it too. Before Marcus could respond, the temperature in the room dropped. His breath misted in the air, and the hairs on his neck stood up straight. A sharp, sudden chill seemed to engulf the cabin, sending a shiver down his spine. Lily stepped closer to him, her hand clutching his arm with a grip so tight it almost hurt. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath, her eyes wide and terrified. "I can't take it anymore, Marcus. I just want to leave." But Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. The pressure in the room was suffocating, the air thick with a feeling that made his stomach churn. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the unease that seemed to press in from all sides. There was something here with them, something that didn't belong. The shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, flickering in time with the dimming firelight. Then suddenly he saw it, movement at the door. He wasn't sure if he was seeing things, but the handle seemed to turn on its own, as though someone was on the other side, trying to get in. The air grew colder still, and Marcus could see his breath, thick and white in the air. His heart raced as the door began to slowly open by itself, creaking on its hinges. "Lily," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking, "stay back." Lily didn't hesitate. She stepped behind him, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She wasn't sure what to expect, but whatever it was not good. The door creaked open a little more, just enough to reveal the dark hallway beyond. But there was no one there. The wind had stopped, and the storm outside had quieted to an unsettling stillness. Marcus moved cautiously toward the door, his feet heavy on the floorboards. He reached for the handle, gripping it with a sweaty palm, but just as he was about to pull it shut, he heard something. A whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. It came from the dark hallway beyond the door, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. "It's too late," the voice whispered, so faint that Marcus wasn't sure he heard it at all. But the feeling in the air, the oppressive weight that hung over them, told him otherwise. Before he could react, something slammed against the door from the outside with such force that it rattled the frame. The sound echoed through the cabin, and Lily screamed, stepping back, her heart pounding in her chest. The door shuddered as if something were pressing against it, trying to get in. "Get away from the door!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Lily by the arm and pulling her back. He slammed the door shut with all his strength, his heart racing as the noise from the other side continued. The rattling grew louder, the sounds more frantic. There was something out there, something trying to get in. Lily looked up at him, her face pale with fear. "What's happening? What's out there, Marcus?" Marcus shook his head, unable to answer her. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding around them. The sound of scratching filled the cabin now, a rhythmic, almost maddening noise, like nails dragging against the wooden door. It grew louder and louder, until it seemed as if the entire house was shaking under the weight of it. And then there was silence. For a brief, terrifying moment, the cabin fell completely still. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting eerie, wavering shadows across the walls. Marcus and Lily stood frozen, their breaths shallow and quick, listening for any sound that would tell them what was happening. But there was nothing. Lily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "What was that? What just happened?" Before Marcus could answer, the sound came again, louder this time, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the walls of the cabin. It wasn't an animal. It was something far worse. The growl reverberated through the floorboards, vibrating the entire cabin as if the very foundation itself were alive. Marcus felt his chest tighten with fear, the air thick and oppressive. He glanced toward the window and then to the dark corners of the room. He knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever was out there was not just trying to get in. It was already inside. The growl stopped, but in its place, there was something worse: silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Lily stood beside Marcus, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. The terror was too much. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The forest outside was as dark as a void, the storm blocking any light. And whatever was inside the cabin was much, much worse than anything they could imagine. Marcus turned to Lily, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out." No. But the door wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a trap. The walls were closing in on them, and the cabin itself seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though it was alive, waiting for them to make a move, to try to escape. Suddenly, the walls groaned, and the lights flickered again. This time, the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally around the room, as if something was moving just out of sight. Then, a soft whisper, so faint it almost didn't register, broke the silence. "Stay with me." Lily's eyes widened, and her grip tightened on Marcus's arm. "Did you hear that?" Marcus nodded slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. "It's happening again," he whispered, his voice shaking. The terror that had gripped them both was no longer something they could ignore. It was real, and it was closing in on them. And as the shadows deepened around them, they both realized one terrifying truth: they were not alone. The clock on the wall ticked in the silence of the house, its rhythmic ticking growing louder with each passing second. James couldn't remember how long he had been sitting there, in the dark, his back pressed against the cold, crumbling wall. The house felt like it was closing in on him, its oppressive atmosphere making it harder to breathe. The cold seeped into his bones, and despite his attempts to focus, his thoughts kept drifting to the strange sounds that had filled the house earlier. There was something off about this place, something more than just the eerie creaks and groans of an old building. Someone was here with him. He glanced over at Sarah, who was huddled on the couch, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her hands trembled in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since they'd entered the house, her mind clearly consumed with the same unsettling thoughts that plagued his own. Every so often she would glance around the room, her gaze darting nervously to the corners, the windows, the door. It was as though she was waiting for something to happen, or worse, for something to appear. James shifted uneasily, his fingers gripping the edge of the couch as he fought to calm his racing heart. He had heard the stories about the house before they arrived. Everyone in town had warned them, had told them it was haunted, that the place had a dark history. But James had never been one to believe in ghost stories. He had thought it was all superstition, a collection of rumors that had grown over time, until they had seen it for themselves. When they first arrived, the house seemed normal enough. A little rundown, maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. The front porch had a layer of dust, the paint on the walls chipped from years of neglect, but it didn't seem any more unsettling than any other abandoned house they had passed on their road trip. They had come to this remote corner of the countryside to get away from everything, to disconnect and spend some time together. But as soon as they stepped inside, everything changed. The air had felt thick, almost suffocating, as though it was charged with some unseen energy. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against you, that fills the space with something unspoken. At first, it was just a strange unease, a feeling that they were being watched, but it quickly turned into something more tangible. The sounds had started slowly, just faint whispers at the edge of their hearing, too soft to pinpoint, but unmistakably there. It wasn't until later, when they had ventured deeper into the house, that the noises became more distinct. There had been knocking at first, a soft rap, like someone was tapping at the walls, but there was no one else in the house. Then, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, coming from the upstairs hallway. But when they went to check, the hallway was empty. No one was there. The rooms had been locked, the windows sealed shut. But the sounds kept coming. James had tried to brush it off. He had convinced himself it was just the house settling, that the wind was playing tricks on them, but Sarah hadn't been so sure. She'd been on edge ever since they'd arrived, her eyes constantly scanning the corners of the room, her hands clenched tight. She had heard the same noises, felt the same presence, but she hadn't been able to shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Now, sitting there in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of the clock ticking and the occasional creak of the house settling, James couldn't ignore it anymore. He could feel it. Something was wrong. Something was in the house with them. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening silence. She didn't answer at first, and he called her name again, louder this time, more urgent. She blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and turned to look at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. She was barely holding it together. I don't know. But I don't think we're alone here," James said, his voice low. He didn't know why he had said it out loud, but now that the words were out, they hung in the air like a dark cloud. The silence between them deepened, and they both listened, straining for any sound beyond the clock. But there was nothing. The house was still. Too still. "You're right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I've been hearing things too. Footsteps. The doors creaking. And the whispers." James felt a chill run down his spine. The whispers. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but now that Sarah had said it out loud, he couldn't deny it anymore. They weren't just hearing things. "I thought I was going crazy," Sarah continued, her eyes darting to the window, then to the door, as if she was waiting for something to appear. "I keep thinking I see things, shadows moving in the corner of my eye. Figures just standing there watching us." James wanted to reassure her, to tell her that it was just the stress, that they were both tired, and the house was playing tricks on their minds. But he couldn't. He had seen it too, the shadows that moved when they weren't looking, the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. He knew deep down that something was wrong. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just abandoned. It was alive in some way, with a presence that couldn't be explained. Suddenly, there was a noise. A soft thud, like something falling to the floor upstairs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. James held her gaze, but neither of them moved. The thud came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the floor. The footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moved closer, closer to the stairs. They both turned toward the door, but there was no way out. They were trapped. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, and for a long moment, there was complete silence. Then the sound of someone, coming down the stairs, slow and measured, each step heavy with the weight of something that didn't belong. The floorboards creaked under the weight of an unseen presence, and James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "James," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What do we do?" But James didn't have an answer. The door was locked, the windows sealed. There was nowhere to run. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. James's hand shook as he reached for the old, tarnished doorknob, but before he could turn it, there was a sharp, sudden knock on the door. The sound echoed through the room, and Sarah screamed, her fear palpable as it filled the space between them. James tried to keep his composure, but his mind was racing. Who, or what, was on the other side of that door? What did it want from them? The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of a voice, low and distorted, creeping under the doorframe. "Let me in," the voice whispered, a hiss of a sound, like a breath from a deep, dark place. "Let me in." James's heart skipped a beat, and he pulled Sarah closer, his body trembling. The voice wasn't just a voice. It was a command, a desperate plea, filled with a malevolence that chilled him to his very core. And then the door burst open. The wind howled through the open doorway, and the temperature dropped. The air was thick with a presence that seemed to fill the room, pressing in on them from every direction. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, and the faint outline of a figure appeared in the doorway, tall, indistinct, but unmistakably there. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form. Sarah screamed again, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching them, waiting. James's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. They were trapped in this house, surrounded by something they couldn't understand, something that wanted them. And as the figure stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind it, and the room plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed in the dark hallway, each step deliberate, measured, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she clutched James's arm tighter, her nails digging into his flesh, but he didn't feel it. His entire body was tense, his mind racing, trapped in a whirlwind of disbelief and terror. He had always believed in logic, in the tangible world, the one where things could be explained, understood. But this was something beyond reason, beyond any explanation he had ever known. There was no science, no theory, no possibility that could make sense of what they were experiencing. The figure that had appeared in the doorway, tall, shadowed, its form seemingly made from the very darkness around it, was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence, something with weight, something that filled the room, pushing the air out of their lungs with its very existence. It was moving now, slowly, gliding forward with unnatural ease, its footsteps eerily soft despite the oppressive weight it carried. The temperature had dropped even further, and the air was so cold it bit at their skin, as if frost was creeping from the walls themselves. I don't think it's real," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes darting between James and the dark figure. "I don't think it's a person." Her gaze locked on the figure's vague outline, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the more she stared, the less it made sense. The shadows seemed to shift and swirl around the figure, forming a shape that flickered in and out of clarity. It was as if reality itself was bending, the very fabric of the world warping around it. James's voice was barely a whisper as he responded, "It's here, though. I can feel it." His eyes widened, his breath shallow, as if every second that passed was an eternity. His body ached with the need to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on him. The door was still wide open behind them, but the figure didn't step through it. It didn't need to, it was already here, suffocating them in its presence. Suddenly, a soft, eerie chuckle filled the room, low and guttural, the sound of something not quite human. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if it had been lingering in the air the entire time, waiting to be noticed. The laughter was so hollow, so empty, it sent a shiver through their bones. It was the kind of laugh that belonged to something ancient, something that had no place in the world of the living. "Why are you here?" Sarah's voice was barely audible, a whisper so faint it almost seemed like a prayer. Her eyes never left the figure, even as it loomed closer. The laugh died down, replaced by a cold silence, broken only by the distant wind that howled outside. The figure's presence seemed to grow with the silence, its shadow stretching across the floor like a dark tide, slowly swallowing the light from the room. James felt his stomach churn, a sense of dread filling him to the brim. He wanted to move, to scream, to break free from the unrelenting grip of fear that held him in place, but his body refused to obey. It was as if his very soul had been paralyzed by the force in front of him. The shadowy figure didn't seem to care for their fear, didn't seem to notice them at all. It just stood there, its form flickering, shifting, almost as if it was growing, becoming larger and more oppressive with each passing second. "What do you want?" Sarah's voice shook, the question hanging in the air like a desperate plea for an answer. The figure didn't respond. Instead, its form began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The shadows that had clung to its edges grew sharper, more defined, as if it were pulling itself together from the very darkness around it. The air around them seemed to warp, twisting, suffocating, as though it were bending to the will of whatever this thing was. It reached forward, a dark hand extending from its misty form, fingers long and unnatural, stretching impossibly far. The shadows around it writhed, as if alive, curling and wriggling like tendrils, like something trying to break free from its own confines.